Well and well met, adventurers from the kingdom of Gamelot. The time was the early 80s, and I, a mere lad of about 13, became introduced to fantasy gaming when I joined a little lunchtime club at San Lorenzo Junior High called, aptly enough, the Game Club. I had heard about Dungeons & Dragons, Gamma World, Boot Hill, etc. from my very small group of friends, but I had no idea how they were played or what role-playing games meant. I, of course, grew up playing Milton Bradley board games and card games and was fortunate enough to have an Atari 2600 with about 10 different titles when most kids only had Pong. The Game Club launched with a homebrew created by our game master Tad called Warlords of Alpha Centauri. Shortly thereafter, we started a D&D campaign, and I was mesmerized. By 8th grade, I was obsessed with D&D, had moved on to another school, and started my own club. My parents were wary of the game, and I admit my fascination with it led me into some dark corners in the library that made them uncomfortable. By 9th grade, the D&D panic that swept the country was full-blown, and my parents had stuck me into a fundamentalist Christian school run by a church full of ex-New Agers and former occultists. As you might imagine, they pretty much clocked my D&D hobby as a gateway to my eventual ascendancy as a Dark Lord Warlock. Or something. They managed to scare the crap out of my parents and as a result, I burned all of my D&D manuals and Dragon magazines, along with my homebrew D&D modules and supplements, and the first 17 black and white magazine format issues of ElfQuest. I was allowed to keep my Narnia books, though, because C.S. Lewis was a Christian. Living in the Santa Cruz Mountains, just south of Silicon Valley, my best friend's dad was a computer professor at De Anza College. Having lost my dungeon dice, I became fascinated by computers, and in my sophomore year of high school, at the aforementioned anti-Hogwarts school for young Republicans, anti-liberals, and radical right-wingers, I found myself taking a class in computer science taught by a computer engineer from Hewlett-Packard. My parents bought a Commodore VIC-20 for my best friend's dad, and boy, did my life change. I became obsessed with creating my own choose-your-own-adventure style computer games. I had owned a copy of Barbarian Prince, a solo fantasy game, which also got incinerated, but I managed to find an Avalon Hill game at the thrift store called Outdoor Survival that, while not the same, certainly had some similar elements. I had a couple of ideas for games and read an article about Richard Garriott, aka Lord British, creator of Ultima, and I took for my game-creating alter ego the name of Cosmo Adventure. I never finished the game, nor did I go on to become the software engineer I was so sure I was going to be in high school. Though I did manage to write a bubble sorting subroutine for a Commodore 64-based typing program that was sent worldwide to homeschooled missionary kids. I was attending college when my mom told me that my younger brother was wanting to play D&D and asked if I could talk to him about it. I had never really gotten over fantasy as a genre, and I had long thought that there should be a Christian D&D. There was something that seemed to fit that bill, a game that I had first played the summer before while working at a day camp in SoCal. Here was my chance. I made a deal with my brother and my mom that I would steer my brother away from secular D&D and instead introduce him to Dragon Raid. It should be noted that the originators of Dragon Raid chafe at their creation being categorized as a role-playing game. Its creators call it an adventure learning system, which stresses scripture memorization to be able to wield word prunes, which have magical effects without actually being considered witchcraft by the rules. Additionally, all fantastical creatures were evil. Your character's stats included scores for fruits of the spirit, and the game was heavy on allegory and evangelical overtones. To be honest, if played the way it was written, the adventure master, GM, or whatever, is little more than a glorified narrator given meticulously written paragraphs to read verbatim, and that just wasn't to my liking. I recognized the potential, however, and made a decision to keep the core concepts and mechanics, but abandon the narration in favor of a more DM style of refereeing. After familiarizing myself with the basics of the introductory adventure, I cobbled together a group of players that ultimately included my former college roommate, a musician buddy of mine, my best friend from grade school, my younger brother, and one of his friends. The first session went amazingly well, I believe, because of my D&D background and the fact that I ran it RPG style instead of reading the adventure scenario paragraphs word for word. The success of that first session ignited a fire in me that had been smoldering for years. I was back in my element, playing my kind of game, albeit with a heavy emphasis on a Christian thing. At the time, I saw it as my spiritual duty to use this game to evangelize and impart Christian values and scripture memorization, because Jesus. But I knew that if I wanted to compete with secular fantasy role-playing games, I had to make sure my Dragon Raid sessions would be every bit as fun as D&D or better. That was my rationale, but truth be told, I was overjoyed to have a sanctified excuse to revisit Gamelot, the local game store that was the mecca of my dungeon-crawling devotee all those years before. A few weeks and about $200 later, I had over 100 lead figures of the Forgotten Realms town set, battle maps, and a spectacular book of caverns and catacomb cutouts that I used to make enormous dungeons that covered my living room floor. Many happy weekends were spent crammed into said living room with my merry little band of brothers, subsisting on cold pizza, soda, day-old donuts, and critical hits. In the early 90s, I developed a complete set of rules for late 20th century infantry wargaming with 1/72nd scale miniatures. I completed the basic rules just in time for Command & Conquer to completely change the gaming world. Suddenly, tabletop and turn-based wargames were out, and the real-time strategy computer game era was born. In the years since, I made a couple of forays into the Star Trek role-playing play-by-email scene, played most of the seminal first-person shooters, Doom, Duke Nukem 2, Quake, Quake 2, Unreal, Half-Life, Dark Forces 2, Star Trek Online, KOTOR, etc., and racked up thousands of laps on half a dozen racing games. Between 2007 and 2015, I got pretty involved in a few online sandbox games like Minecraft, Second Life, and of course GTA. Yes, I know. Second Life is not a game. It's an online virtual platform for social interaction and creative expression. Yeah, I get it. It also contains hundreds of different gaming opportunities, from zombie hunts to vampire role-playing games, and a whole lot of freaky stuff in between. So, game, but not for children. In an attempt to get more exercise and make some new friends, I got really into the augmented reality game Ingress for a bit. The fictional secret society rivalry reminded me of the contest that played out in real time and in real life in the San Francisco area between fictitious factions of the Jejune Institute and the equally fictionalized Elsewhere Society. If you don't know what I'm referring to, you should check out the fascinating documentary, The Institute. It's also the subject of AMC's new show, Dispatches from Elsewhere. In 2015, I stumbled across Critical Hit, a Dungeons & Dragons podcast on Spotify. What an amazing show. Hundreds of hours of D&D 5th edition goodness really made me wish for a Wayback Machine. I called my brother to see if he still had my figures and DM supplies. He didn't. I tried D&D online, and I really wanted to like it, but nothing I played online ever came close to capturing the feeling of pen and paper fantasy role-playing. I liked listening to Critical Hit and almost went out and bought the new D&D starter set, but 5th edition rules just seemed really complicated to me. Around the same time, I kept hearing about homebrew D20 games. D20 games, I learned, make use of and allow you to modify to your heart's content the original AD&D rules, all of which are now in the public domain. I began working on a new original fantasy RPG under my old moniker, Cosmo Adventure. I got as far as world creation and a decent start on the races and character classes before life got in the way again. My middle son got into D&D with some college friends, and I gave him my dice, and that was that. I kind of gave up on games in general, but like an amputee with a phantom itch, I just can't seem to let it go. Games of all types still fascinate me, and the internet has this wonderful way of letting a person with a history of ADHD instantaneously access information on whatever random topic happens to pop into their head at any one moment. It was one such spontaneous brain itch that led me to see if I could find anything about the old Barbarian Prince game. Sure enough, not only can you find all the materials online, but they're free to print out and use. This got my head spinning. I started watching YouTube videos with gameplay and commentary on the game system, which in turn made me think of all the games that I had created and played over the years. I decided it was once again time for Cosmo Adventure to stride forth into the world, this time via social media. And thereby Cosmo's Cauldron was born. I took for my tagline the phrase, "From the Kingdom of Gamelot," in homage to the little game store of the same name which sadly is no longer in business. Part podcast, part vlog, and all nerdy cool, this foray into the realms of imagination is all about games. All kinds of games, from improvised games with sticks and rocks, to board games, card games, tabletop war games, sports games, and fantasy role-playing games. Along the way, we will cover gaming supplies, miniatures, DM resources, and most importantly, how to make your own games. In addition, we will be revisiting some of the games I created over the years, and I will be releasing them for you to play yourself. It's my hope that you will join me in this epic journey of discovery and delight.